Good morning. I'd like to thank the Middle East Policy Council for their very kind invitation. I think one of the biggest mistakes that the Quartet made in this whole crisis was its failure to communicate the problem adequately to US elite opinion. The suddenness of the crisis, the surprise of it, took people in Washington, as witnessed by my two distinguished predecessors on the podium, totally by surprise. And I think as a result, that has led to a misreading of the roots of the crisis. And one of the reasons was, as Tim correctly put, that the issues between the Gulf Cooperation Council have been handled within the family for a long time, have not been advertised, and hence public opinion abroad or in the region has not been well briefed on what was happening. This crisis has a history to it. And the history actually goes back to 1995, when the father emir of the current emir overthrew his father. Slightly complicated between father and son, but he overthrew his father, and the Gulf leaders at that time around Qatar took exception to that. They were elderly leaders, and the idea of, Junior overthrowing his father was not taken very well. So when the father came back a year later and tried to grab power back, the countries surrounding Qatar helped the father. Unfortunately, they did a bit like what Kennedy did in the Bay of Pigs. They helped a little bit, not enough to get the job done, so they just wounded, in a way, the Emir of Qatar, the father Emir today, who took it very personally. And he and the Prime Minister at that time felt that they were going to get revenge. And effectively, they proceeded to do that over the next 20 years. The issue with Qatar today, and what has not been communicated, is that the Qataris have been working to undermine the internal security of their neighbors. And that is what has raised the issue to the level of anxiety and anger that we see today. Now, that manifested itself in many different ways. Something that people are not very much aware of in Washington is that when Colonel Gaddafi was overthrown in Libya, his security files, the vaults, if you want, of the Qataris, of the Libyan Secret Service were opened up, and recordings of discussions between Colonel Gaddafi, the Emir of Qatar, and his Prime Minister were released publicly. And in those discussions, the Emir of Qatar tells Gaddafi, he tells him that we are funding the Saudi opposition, and he named them by name. We are also searching out Saudi officers and government officials who travel abroad to subvert them, basically to buy them. And we are working to bring down the Saudi royal family, and he promises Gaddafi that the Saudi royal family will not be around 12 years hence. He also has a plan where he tells Gaddafi that we're going to divide Saudi Arabia into 3 countries. We're going to separate the western region, which has Mecca and Medina. We're going to separate the eastern region, which has all the oil, and we're going to leave the Saudi royal family in the center with no oil and no water. So those recordings in themselves were a culmination of a period of intrigue and subversion that the Qataris had been carrying out, and understandably, Saudi Arabia was outraged. However, King Abdullah at that time, in the traditional order of how things were managed between Gulf leaders, accepted Kuwaiti mediation, quiet mediation, confidential mediation. And as a result, the Qataris apologized. The Prime Minister came over to Riyadh, the Emir came over to Riyadh, and they came up with an excuse. And that led to a series of agreements between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Qatar that committed each party, as Tim mentioned, actually, they committed all parties not to interfere in the internal security of their neighbors, not to use their media as an arm to give a platform to parties that wanted to undermine the security of their neighbors, including Al Jazeera, by the way. And the Qatari government in those agreements admitted that fact, and actually admitted to and agreed in the agreements that they would close down Jazeera Mubashir, which was a direct Egyptian channel that the Egyptian government was very upset about because it felt it was promoting the agenda of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, this was all a confidential agreement. It was signed by the leaders of those countries. And without getting into too much detail, that agreement was signed. The Qataris broke it within the next 6, 7, 10 months. The Kuwaitis came in again, and another agreement was signed a year later, which again reiterated all the commitments that the Qataris have made. And this was all done by 2014. So by 2014, there had been a nearly 20-year track record of behavior on behalf of the Qataris towards their neighbors. There had been multiple attempts at mediation. There had been 2 incidents of their neighbors pulling their embassies or ambassadors away from Qatar. So there had been a long history of mediation, of crisis, of discussion, of promises that the Qataris undertook. And then those actions did not stop. Now, there was a feeling when the father emir retired, which happened just before the signing of those 2013-2014 agreements, and which gave the quartet a feeling of optimism, because the understanding was that the father was the man who had borne the grudge from 1995, he and his prime minister, and by them retiring and by the young emir coming, that baggage would no longer be there, and there was an opportunity to rebuild a new relationship. Unfortunately, what happened, it turns out, is that after the father emir retired, he seems to have retained the Saudi, Emirati, Bahraini file. So while his son has been, running other things, the father has continued with that and continued doing what they were doing before, attempting to do it in a sort of cleverer way, quote unquote. For example, while they reduced the opportunities for Jazeera to give the opposition within the Emirates and within Saudi Arabia a platform, the father emir went out and invested in media companies in Turkey and in the UK, which adopted the agenda of the Brotherhood. So ultimately, the leaders felt after all these years that they are facing existential threats. They're facing existential threats from Iran and from her proxies in the region, and they're facing existential threats from Sunni jihadism. And that would be very difficult to fight when a member of the club, a brother state within the Gulf GCC, is working to undermine them from within. Now, that was always very difficult for them to understand, because ultimately Qatar has a vested interest in the security of its neighbors. Qatar is like a wooden house in a neighborhood full of wooden houses. If it sets a fire in Saudi Arabia, it would be inconceivable that Qatar would survive if the security of Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Bahrain, for that matter, was affected. So that's why it always surprised the countries around them that the Qataris continued to behave like this. So then I think when, in the days of the Obama administration, there was a feeling that the Obama administration would have relegated this issue to an unending series of meetings and debates, and now no action would have been taken. And the feeling was that we have tried with the Qataris for 20 years, we have mediated with them, we've signed multiple agreements with them, nothing is working. Now, one option would be to go to war, which would have been the responsible option. The other option was to say, look, we are going to isolate ourselves from you. We're going to isolate you from us. That is not a blockade, because Qatar retains its seaports and it retains its airports, and it has the resources to connect to the whole world. So, but it's isolating them from their neighborhood, isolating them from their geographical depth, from their family really, because ultimately Qatar is integrally tied to the Arabian Peninsula. So even though they can talk about building a relationship with Turkey or with Iran, they have no choice. I mean, geography and history and ethnicity determine that their future is tied to their neighbors. So the feeling was that that decisive action has to be taken. The mistake was it was not communicated well. And as a result, it hit the American policy community by surprise. And frankly, with 2020 hindsight, what the quartet should have done was on the day that the action was taken, it should have released the documents, which it didn't release till a month later, the 3 agreements that were signed between the 4 countries. And it should have said, we signed these agreements in 2013 and 2014. We have waited 3 years for them to be implemented. They have not been implemented. As a result, we are cutting ourselves off from Qatar today. I think that would have given a clarity and a precision to the issue that is still missing today. So, you know, with all due respect to Perry, when people come and say, you know, it's a bit of a silly thing, his attitude actually is prevalent among the analyst community, because people still haven't gotten their hand around it. And when I go around Washington and I mention, for example, the recordings that came out, very few people, even experts, even you know, people in the State Department or in government have actually heard those tapes. So it's been a big failure in communication on the part of the quartet. But really the conclusion is that Qatar has to be brought into line. It has to stop this behavior. Absolutely, as Tim said, everybody should practice the same behavior. The rules should apply to all, and I don't think there's any dispute on the side of the neighbors that the rules should apply to everybody. Nobody should subvert the internal security of their neighbor. Nobody should give funding, support, nationality, or host members of their opposition who want to bring down their surrounding governments. Nobody should give a platform to organizations, whether they are direct Saudi Emirati organizations or organizations like Al-Nusra or Hezbollah, which are revolutionary organizations which want to bring down the ruling order in the region, and hence indirectly also are working to subvert the security of these countries. So I think there's a total agreement on that issue. The question is, there is zero trust in the leadership of Qatar, particularly in the presence of the father. I think the feeling is that as long as the father of the emir continues to exercise power behind the scenes, a deal will not be reached. But if the Qataris commit to the agreements that they signed, and if our friends in America are able to guarantee, co-sign, add their prestige to those agreements, I really don't see that this problem cannot be solved. But bearing that, this blockade will continue, because frankly, it will work, and it is working. The Qataris can afford, they can have the money to wait, but it's expensive. And it's economically expensive for them, but at the end of the day also it's psychologically expensive for them, because their people, their tribes are intricately tied to the Arabian Peninsula, and obviously they are now cut off from their geography. So it is the only civilized approach to take in trying to pressure Qatar to come back into the fold and become a responsible member of the Gulf Cooperation Community. That is essential if the Gulf Cooperation Community is going to successfully fight jihadi, Sunni jihadi and Shia jihadi extremism in the region. They have to work the way Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Bahrain work very well together now. And until that happens, I don't see a rapid solution to this problem. Thank you.
I think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding also that Saudi Arabia would like to turn Qatar into, you know, a vassal state, and that the issue is the arrogant, larger neighbor annoyed by the upstart, younger or smaller power. It may be annoyed sometimes by the Qataris, and certainly even some of the Qatari behavior in Libya and places like that might be annoying. But that is not what drove this. What drove it was the feeling that Qatar was working to undermine the internal security of the country. The feeling, for example, clerics have been arrested in Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago, where the government has discovered that the Qatari government has for years been having these clerics on its payroll. Millions of dollars have been spent, and these are clerics that have millions of followers. One of them has 14 million followers on Twitter. So they are, in a way, a political force. So this interference, this meddling in the internal security was what incensed the Saudi government. Yes, did Qatar want to be bigger, play a big role on the world stage? Was that irritating sometimes? Sure, but that never would have. I mean, Saudi Arabia lived through Kuwait. Kuwait did that in the 60s. King Faisal used to say that there are three superpowers in the world: the Soviet Union, the US, and Kuwait, because the Kuwaitis had this same attitude in the 60s and 70s of wanting to stand out and not be overshadowed by their giant neighbor, Saudi Arabia. Kuwait only, in a way, came to its senses when Saddam invaded Kuwait, and the Kuwaitis realized that it was the strategic depth of Saudi Arabia that saved them. It was the fact that Saudi Arabia is part of the same club of tribal monarchies, and the Saudi royal family stood with the Kuwaiti royal family. Otherwise, Kuwait would have disappeared. So that has never been a behavior that would have elicited the reaction that you saw now. The reaction was a direct effort to subvert the security of the neighbors. The Emiratis had the same issue, the Bahrainis had the same issue. And this had been documented, videotaped, recorded, at multiple occasions over 20 years. So the agreements and the Qataris, there had been multiple opportunities and meetings where these grievances were expressed and where promises were made by the Qataris to desist. As a result, after the tapes were released from Gaddafi's vaults, the Emir of Kuwait brought the Emir of Qatar to see King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, and then King Abdullah told him, "I don't trust your word." Because he said, "I promise not to do this. I promise we will not do this again." He said, "I don't believe you. Let's put it on paper," which is why the first agreement in 2013 was actually handwritten. It was handwritten because the King of Saudi Arabia told the Qataris, "I don't believe your word." They broke that. A year later, there was a more formal summit. There was a more detailed agreement. There was a more detailed addendum signed by the foreign ministers. And they still broke that. So the problem now is that the quartet countries, they don't believe the Qataris, the word of the Qataris, and they don't trust the signature of the Qataris. So any agreement that would have to be reached with Qatar would need some sort of a US, I think, verification, where the US became a party to it, and as a result, the Qataris would take, give that much more weight. So that is the history, really. It's a history of direct interference and a feeling that they wanted to undermine the security and bring the systems down, really. They bring the systems of government down, which is mind-boggling when you think of it, because it can hardly be in Qatar's interest for the Qataris to do something like that. Now, the failure to communicate, the fact that these agreements were only leaked a month after the crisis. Unfortunately, in our part of the world, communication is not an integral part of policymaking. So policymakers take decisions, and then effectively they allow the other party to define the story, and then they respond. While American politicians, Western politicians, from minute one, they have learned that you have to communicate, and the communication strategy has to be an integral part of any policy step that you take. That lack of communication is what has caused the confusion until today, really, in Washington. I mean, there always is a rallying of the flag in the beginning of a crisis. But I think, as you see, when people cheered as the troops went off to war in Europe at the First World War, when you rally around the flag, but after a while, when you pay a price, the Qatari people are going to ask themselves, is that necessary? What does Qatar gain from alienating its neighbors? You know, and you know, there was an element. I mean, the father emir had views about the future of the Arab world, and he wanted to help restructure Syria. But those were secondary. I mean, his attempts or his visions about playing a sort of a role in shaping the future of the Arab world really were secondary to the direct behavior towards his neighbors. And that is where the communication has been flawed, because people don't understand that. So they mix up Qatari behavior in Libya with Qatari funding of Saudi opposition, or giving them a platform, or working to undermine this direct security of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Bahrain. And I think this is where the whole mess comes in, because people are, there are priorities and there are issues that cross the red line, and there are issues that irritate but don't cross the red line.
Well, a point of fact, Ali, these secret agreements were released by CNN and then
Yes.
and then provided by your website?
No, they were released by CNN. I mean, somebody leaked them to CNN.
So they are available, they can be read.
We have copies of them on our website, but I mean, they're on the CNN website.
Right,
Yes.
so they can be read. But back to these
But I mean, my point was that those agreements should have been integral. From minute one, the statement should have said, here's the agreements, and then we would have come to our friends in the State Department and said, America likes to uphold the rule of law. Here's the rule of law. Here are 3 agreements signed by, you know, and certified. And why don't you help us do that? You see, there would have been less confusion, I think. And then Mr. Lundy King would have been much more supportive of upholding the rule of law, as they say. The issue of terrorism, unfortunately, the usage of that word, the quartet thought that that was a clever way to address this crisis because of all the obsession in America and the West about terrorism. But I think that confused it, you see, because, yes, of course, they're supporting terrorist organizations, but particularly the understanding of terrorism in America is a bit confused. So that had the message been more on the direct, you have the right to protect your internal security as any country, and had the message been more directed at that they are working to undermine our internal security, I think that would have been more clearly understood here. I repeat myself, but look at the model of Kuwait. If you look at the history of Kuwait in the 60s and 70s, it was exactly that. It was the little power that was an irritant, that was uncomfortable with being overshadowed by Saudi Arabia, that irritated Saudi Arabia. It annoyed, it upset Saudi Arabia. But there was never a cut of relations, there was never any hostility, and that behavior stopped after the invasion of Kuwait. So my point is that the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia would not have reacted with the extreme anger that they've reacted now if that had not crossed the line from being an irritant to being an active agent of subversion. And, you know, whether what they were doing, now the Qataris also another, if you want, an irritant. I mean, the Qataris were talking about the wave of the future and democracy, when Qatar itself is a total, you know, autocracy like everybody else. So when they talk about freedom of the press for Jazeera, for example, well, they allow the Saudi opposition to go on Jazeera, but the Qatari opposition never, you know, sees the light of day. In fact, a poet in Qatar who had criticized the emir and called for the Arab Spring to come to Qatar was thrown in jail for 5 years. So this nonsense. There's a very interesting YouTube clip for President Obama. He said, I had the emir of Qatar today, and he's a powerful man. And, you know, he's been saying democracy, democracy, democracy all over the Arab world, which is great, but Qatar itself is the democracy. So there's a bit of nonsense and hypocrisy there that shouldn't be confused. And had they said that, even that wouldn't have irritated. It was crossing the red line of subversion that blew this relationship up. I think regime change is something that the Gulf countries take with great caution. So it is being talked about now, but underlying it, I think if the father, and this is my personal opinion, but if the father emir retires actually from the picture, I think things can be solved quite quickly with the existing government. So, you know, the concept of regime change is something that the Gulf countries have been very careful about not playing for a very long time. So I still think that there are tactical things. For example, unfortunately, in the 13 points that were made, one of the points was closing down Al Jazeera, which gave the Qataris a big public relations coup because they were able to turn around and say, you want to close down the free press, and every journalist in the world suddenly started to, went to their side. When really the issue wasn't closing Jazeera down. It was just letting Jazeera treat Saudi Arabia the way it treats Qatar. You see? So exactly what Tim was saying, apply the same laws, apply onto your neighbor what you want your neighbor to apply to you. The Financial Times broke a story about a month into the crisis, which talked about a ransom of $1 billion being paid by the Qataris to Shia and Sunni militia in Iraq. Now, and this was validated by a third party, which was the Prime Minister of Iraq, because he came out and said that the Iraqi government had caught Qatari diplomats trying to smuggle $500 million in cash to give to the Hashd al-Sha'bi as a ransom. The Qataris came out and said, no, this was money that we're going to give as aid to the Iraqi government. If you want to give aid to the Iraqi government, you transfer from your central bank to your central bank. You don't carry $500 million in cash, right? So that sort of behavior and money, those $1 billion, part of it ended up with Sunni jihadis, and part of it ended up with Iranian-supported Hashd Sha'bi. Now, why on earth Qatar would want to, allow, even if it was a ransom? I mean, you don't let the mafia, even if they've arrested members of your family, no government would allow that sort of money that could power them for the next 10 years to be given. That sort of irresponsible behavior, whether the Qataris thought that would give them influence, whether they thought it would give them protection, money, nobody can make sense of that. But why on earth would you give the Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq, which not only talks about wanting to ethnically cleanse Iraq, but talks about wanting to come into Saudi Arabia? And why would you give, the Sunni jihadi organizations in Syria, which again want to topple the ruling order in Saudi Arabia, that sort of money? That is the sort of behavior that was incomprehensible. And to come and say that we just, and I found the reaction of Americans, policymakers here, a bit surprising, because they said, oh, well, it's just a ransom, whether it was $5 million, whether it's $1 billion, is a ransom. And I said, this is a epoch-changing amount of money that you can deploy in a totally irresponsible manner. So if you think, again, this boils down to, does Qatar think that they're buying protection by giving these effectively terrorist criminal organizations hundreds of millions of dollars of money? And this is a sort of behavior that also incensed. So it's not really the 50,000, because when you look at the funding of the terrorist organizations in Syria, yes, they've gotten contributions from individuals in the Gulf, but the core of their money has been, smuggling, has been plunder, which is what revolutionary organizations, when they take territory, fund themselves with. The Bolsheviks did that in Russia for the first 10 years, taking the wealth, plundering the banks. So, 50,000 here or 100,000 here, but $1 billion, that's something that beggars belief, really. And until today, there is no explanation for it. I think, the why there's confusion about the Muslim Brotherhood is because in the 60s, the Muslim Brotherhood was fighting Nasser, and Nasser was trying to bring down the ruling order in the Gulf. So the Saudi government welcomed them in, gave them jobs in universities and schools, and only recognized decades later that they had brought a level of political thinking into conservative, if you want the religious establishment there, into the conservative religious establishment, the level of political thinking and sophistication and transnationalism in the political sense. The Saudi religious establishment had always been wanting to promote the faith, but King Abdulaziz, when he set up the Saudi state, he purposefully did not take on the title of caliph, even though that was an opportune time for him, because the caliphate had fallen down and he had taken control of Mecca and Medina, and many people actually raised that possibility. And he wanted to send a message that Saudi Arabia does not aspire to transnational expansion. And in fact, there was an internal civil war with what were called the Ikhwan which were the sort of very right-wing Wahhabi warriors that wanted to take that. So when the Muslim Brotherhood came in, by the time of the early 90s, the Saudi government realized that they had infected what became called the Sahwa movement in Saudi Arabia, which was they had helped create a politically much more active clerical class that looked to sort of a transnational Muslim state. So I think they began to be worried about them in the 90s. Obviously, that worry, now mind you, that worry reached an extreme when they took power in Egypt, because suddenly they had a platform of the largest, most important country in the region. And that's when, if you want, the alarm bells started to go off and everybody started to look in their backyard and see who was, because the Muslim Brotherhood is a bit of like a cult. And when it took control of a state as important as Egypt, suddenly the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and other governments started to look with much more concern around them. Qatar, in its hubris, thought that it could somehow influence or control the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think that's a fundamental difference of opinion, because the Muslim Brotherhood can use Qatar and can use its platforms and can use its money, but Qatar will never be able to influence them. So I think the view was that the Qataris were playing a very dangerous game for themselves also, not just by supporting, funding, and giving the Muslim Brotherhood, hosting them, and giving them a platform on television. And that was one of the reasons why in the 2013-2014 agreement, closing down Qatar Mubashir, Jazeera Mubashir, which was a dedicated Jazeera channel for Egypt, was so important, and which the Qataris ultimately did. But what they did was they closed down Jazeera Mubashir, but then they went and set up 2 new channels or more in Turkey and in London to do the same job. And that is what, so on one side they committed to the agreement, on the other side they subverted it.
Okay, we've talked about 2 of the 3 grievances. The third is Iran, Qatar's relations with Iran. People in the audience are asking, what was the nature of that relationship? Was it more than what you would call the normal hedging that a small power takes when it is in a coalition with a larger power?
Can I address that, actually, the Iran issue, because that's a very good point.
But people are asking, how much choice did Qatar have when they share that large natural gas field with Iran? And what was the nature of the relationship that would have been threatening, for example, to Bahrain?
No, look, there's always been an understanding that Qatar has to have a special relationship with Iran because it shares the North Pars gas field. So I don't think anybody held that against them, and I don't think that Qatar's diplomatic relationships and discussions or if you want, civilized relationship with Iran to protect its interests in the gas field were ever held against it. That was never the issue. The issue was when Qatar started supporting Hezbollah or supporting much more direct issues. But nobody in the Gulf says that the Qataris should alienate Iran and put their multi-trillion-dollar investment in the gas field at risk. And again, that's another misconception. The security of Saudi Arabia has a very robust internal security, but the Saudi opposition in London, for example, cooperated with an attempt by Qaddafi to assassinate Crown Prince Abdullah at that time when Qaddafi wanted to settle a personal score with him. Saudi opposition participated in that event, trying to give them logistical support inside the kingdom. There's a Saudi opposition. It's an irritant. It doesn't have much traction in the country, but they have been directly funded by the Qataris, and that came out in the tape by name when the Emir of Qatar said, so-and-so and so-and-so are getting paid by us. Now, the government gets very concerned when it sees these very popular clerics, who really are like rock stars in Saudi Arabia, who are getting millions and millions of dollars, and they have documented transfers of money to accounts that the clerics have in Turkey, for example. And so that the Qataris wouldn't transfer money to Saudi Arabia, but many of these clerics have accounts in Turkey, in Qatari-owned banks in Turkey, and have acquired expensive real estate in Turkey. These are some of the things that have led to these arrests. So the government, I mean, the internal security is very alert and doesn't want to wait till it goes to the next stage, and says that you trying to put on your payroll important clerics in our country that have a wide franchise among the people is a hostile act without us knowing, without our permission. You are trying to, it's a bit like, trying to buy Americans by a foreign country. If you're an American and you get paid by a foreign country, you have to register with the US authorities. So none of those chaps registered as agents of Qatar, shall I put it that way? I don't think so. I mean, there were stories about that, but I really don't think that they really took military action ever seriously. And they understand that would have been a huge complicating factor. It doesn't have to close down Jazeera, in my view. It just has to abide by the agreements in terms of how Al Jazeera behaves, really. As I said, I think my personal opinion is that, and it's very good to hear Tim say that America would be open to that, is that if America became a party to a third variation of the 2013-2014 agreements, I think that would solve it. So there were verbal agreements, there was mediation, there was a written agreement, there's 20 years of history, really. And that's why there is no trust left whatsoever. I think you need to have, the gods witness the agreement, as David said. I think this whole discussion of abdication is actually completely off mark. There is no reason for the king to abdicate. From minute one, he has taken sort of a chairman of the board approach, and the crown prince and the deputy crown prince in the early days, and now the crown prince effectively are running the show day to day, and there is no indication that will happen, nor is that logical for either party. But it's a rumor that's somehow come out, and some think tanks and political consultancies have written extensively about it, and it's spread like virally through even financial markets, and traders have been betting on it, but it's not going to happen. And it won't make any difference. I mean, clearly the king and crown prince obviously are as close as can be in terms of policy. So I think it's easily reconcilable, really. I mean, the Arabs reconciled with Nasser of Egypt after '67, and things were much, much worse. So I think certainly, yes, there's vitriol in this, but there is very, very easy to accept them back into the fold if they behave. So I don't see it as irreconcilable at all, really. As I said, Saudi Arabia has validated the tribal monarchy structure, and had Nasser succeeded in overthrowing the Saudi monarchy in the 60s, or Islamists in the 90s, Qatar and the small Gulf states wouldn't have survived 24 hours. And I think the Kuwaitis understood that in 1990 in a very, personal way. And that's what has changed their attitude and their approach to Saudi Arabia. Ultimately, Qatar's interest is in beefing up the internal security of Saudi Arabia, not in weakening it. And that's why there's this. A writer described Qatar as a child sitting on a keg of dynamite playing with matches, and I found that very appropriate, because I think that they seem not to understand that their internal security is totally tied to the security of their neighbors, and particularly Saudi Arabia, and it's in their interest to do what is being asked of them. It's not a question of sovereignty. And then when you talk about sovereignty, your sovereignty does not allow you to affect the security of other people. When we talk about personal freedom, a human being doesn't have the personal freedom to harm somebody else. So sovereignty is always limited, as is personal freedom limited by the fact that you cannot harm another person. So it is confusing. I mean, people don't fully understand and have never fully understood, particularly the father, in his what goes on in his mind and what has driven him to do what he has done, really. To show you the degree of elasticity, if you want, in the behavior of the GCC towards its neighbors. There have been issues with Oman in the Yemen war, and there's been issues of smuggling across the Omani border from Iran. And those things are being resolved bilaterally and quietly with Oman. So Oman has, there have been serious issues, but things have never gotten to the level that they got with Qatar. And I think that tells you something about the attitude of Saudi Arabia and the other GCC countries to differences within the family. Clearly we are entering into a period of increased tension with Iran. The view in the kingdom and with its neighbors is that Iran poses an existential threat to the ruling order. And really the only way to stand up to that threat is by becoming self-sufficient in being able to deter Iranian aggression. And to do that, an integral component will be bringing everybody within the GCC into conformity with a joint policy to stand up to Iran. And I think over time that's going to happen. And the crisis that may be coming up now with the decertification will only help to drive the risk home to everybody, including the Qataris, and allow that consolidation to take place.